Philo was born in a log cabin in Indian Creek, Utah in 1906. The oldest of 5 children, he was soon put in charge of his younger sisters, Laura and Agnes.
Did you say there was an old picture of me in here somewhere?
Yes, I think so. It's near the front. It's pretty good, too.
Oh. We always lived in remote areas.
In a log cabin.
In a log cabin with no...
We calcimined it.
with no modern facilities. And so he had no, really was never exposed to any of these ideas.
While plowing a field in 1921, a 14-year-old Mormon boy named Philo T. Farnsworth began to think about an idea that would change the world. He wanted to send pictures over the air, like sound over radio. As the story goes, he had a vision in a potato field. He looked down at the tracks left by his disc harrow and imagined tiny electrons creating a similar picture, line by line. His epiphany in the field inspired him to invent the first working electronic television, a feat that most engineers at the time thought was impossible. Crude mechanical devices using rotating discs produced the first flickering pictures. But even at the age of 14, it was obvious to Philo that this technology was doomed. Philo realized there was a more elegant approach to the problem. If he could harness electrons, those tiny particles that travel at the speed of light, it might be possible to reproduce much better pictures with no moving parts. His idea was to have a camera which would focus light onto a light-sensitive surface that would emit a stream of electrons. The ingenious part of his device divided the picture up into lines of light and shade that could be read like words on a page. A rapidly changing electromagnetic field would scan the picture line by line. The electrons collected at the far end of the camera tube would then form a stream of electric pulses that would be transmitted over the airwaves to an antenna. Inside the receiver, the pulses would be converted back into a series of lines, and the picture reconstituted on the television screen. This 14-year-old had the blueprint for an electronic television system. By 1925, Philo was impatient to realize his plans for electronic vision. He described his idea for television to 2 small-time California businessmen, George Everson and Les Gorell. He assured them it was going to be bigger than radio, and they believed him. They agreed to invest $6,000 so he could build a prototype.
He's a 19-year-old boy doing all this. The force of his personality must have been absolutely incredible to achieve this. He convinced them to back him with what was, in effect, their life savings. It was $5,000 that Everson had saved up, and this was his rainy day money, and Gorell actually had to promise money. He had nothing to put in. So their entire life savings go into the story told by this 19-year-old boy who transformed himself before their eyes into a visionary.
The newlyweds left Salt Lake City for Los Angeles in 1926. Philo was 19, Pem 18, and the future of television lay before them. In a small house in Hollywood, they set up a makeshift laboratory in their dining room. Les and George were eager to help the Farnsworths prepare for their After over a year of non-stop effort, Phil was ready to stage the first public demonstration of electronic television. The venue would be Philadelphia's prestigious new science museum, the Franklin Institute. The grandfather of American invention looked on approvingly as curious minds gathered to catch their first glimpse of electronic vision. It was a milestone event that would break attendance records at the museum.
Huge crowds gathered, and we had a small auditorium that would only take 50 people. We had then a viewing screen about a foot in diameter. So they didn't all get a very good view, but they were all excited about it. And our problem was to keep some live entertainment in front of the camera. The sensitivity of the cameras was not anything like we have today. So that we had to have a lot of light.
We have this enormous corporate entity, which is RCA, bearing down with all of their resources on Phil. Phil is essentially standing alone with one patent attorney.
These patent struggles between inventors were fight-to-the-finish battles. They were battles for recognition, they were battles for money. They were enormously draining and stressful.
My father was very much of a racehorse. He saw obstacles and he cleared them. And when you take a racehorse, no matter how good it is, but you keep jumping higher hurdles, eventually you come to a hurdle that the horse would jump, except this is not a jumpable hurdle. And I think in my father's case, this was coming smack up against corporate America of the 30s.
Meanwhile, Farnsworth sailed to England for meetings with John Logie Baird, the architect of mechanical television. If he was able to sell a license to Baird, he could save the company from bankruptcy. On arrival in London, he set up a demonstration of his electronic system. After seeing it, Baird was silent. Mechanical television was finished. The following day, Phil Farnsworth and Baird signed a contract. While Philo filled his trout pond, David Sarnoff was finally ready to unveil RCA television to America. The history books would say that television was born in 1939 at the New York World's Fair. Farnsworth's first public demonstration in Philadelphia, 5 years earlier, was forgotten.
1939. Television is ready to make its official public debut. The setting could hardly be more perfect, the New York World's Fair, where on April 29, 1939, David Sarnoff stated, "We have added radio sight to sound."
It is with a feeling of humbleness that I come to this moment of announcing the birth in this country of a new art so important in its implications that it is bound to affect all society. It is an art which shines like a torch of hope in a troubled world.
Anybody who went to RCA to ask her how television was invented got a long story from them, which involved Sarnoff and Zworykin, but never involved Farnsworth.
Do you recall your estimate?
Of course I remember. I asked something like $100,000.
Your estimate missed by quite a bit. It cost RCA more than $50 million to create, develop, and introduce America's first all-electronic television system.
That kind of spirit or ruthlessness Farnsworth didn't have. He was a sort of a gentle person. He wanted to invent. He didn't understand public relations. He didn't understand manipulating the public. He didn't understand manipulating. He didn't want to manipulate. He wanted to invent.
After 7 years of crippling litigation, Farnsworth finally won his case against RCA. In October 1939, Sarnoff
Through my childhood, his reaction to television was, there's nothing on it worthwhile, and we're not going to watch it in this household, and I don't want it in your diet, your intellectual diet.